So the reason this is important that we have all these different groupings come together and express the same goal, which is a change to the political system.
I want to get to that last part as to what kind of change they're looking for. What was the context in which that Amini's death would spark this type of uprising, and B, that we're seeing this type of ethnic solidarity that may have not been there as obvious in the past?
Right. So it may have been there. It just hadn't really sort of percolated so visibly to the surface, in part because, the minorities hadn't really dared. They hadn't really had the courage to rise up to the way they have this time around. And this is because, the worst repression has happened within those minority regions, whether it's the Arabs in Khuzestan in the southwest of Iran, the Kurds in the northwest, the Azaris in the northwest, the Baluch in the southeast, the Lurs even in the central plateau. So because of the more extreme repression that has been imposed on the minorities, they hadn't really had the courage to rise up to the extent that they have. But it was a sort of, loop, sort of feeding loop effect where they rose up in Kurdistan and instantly people rose up all across the country in solidarity. And that really gave them a support and spirit to continue their protests. And also in Baluchistan, where every Friday people have gathered after Friday prayers to express protests. And, a large number of the people who have been killed by the regime in this very revolutionary uprising of the last 12 weeks have been Kurds and Baluchis. And so we have to hold on to that fact. But I think it really has been a sort of national consensus that the current regime holds so much impunity. There's so much corruption. The sort of the politics of grief and death, people are sick and tired of it. And so this national solidarity around that has encouraged and energized everybody to rise up and express solidarity with each other.
Has the regime been actively doing... has the regime had an active strategy to maintain some type of ethnic rivalry, or no?
It's not as such, really. I mean, because again, it wouldn't really have too much hold within, Iranian cultural and national mentality, because many families are diverse. They have their intermarriages between, Kurds and, let's say, Persian speakers, or Kurds and Azaris. And so it's not the kind of situation like Iraq, let's say, where sectarianism really has been, a successful sort of strategy for some politicians.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the origins of the morality police, the group that was responsible for the death of Mahsa Amini. To me, from the outside, it seems like a glorified street gang that now has legitimacy and has gotten so over a period of time. Can you give us a rundown of that process and I guess how the Iranian Revolution sparked their existence and where they're at today?
Yeah, so the morality police initially used to just be called the committees, and this started a few years into the revolution. In 1983, Iran's hijab law was actually systematized and formalized legally so that all Iranian women in public after the age of puberty had to cover up. And so with that, you had these vans and cars going around the cities and admonishing or apprehending women who, in their opinion, weren't covered up enough. In 2005, the Ahmadinejad government actually formalized this and put the morality police force under the auspices of the police. And so it became much more sort of regulated. It was supposed to go against the sort of haphazard, events that would take place with the committees roaming the streets, which, as you said, were sort of, glorified vigilantes. And so this formalization was supposed to be actually a kind of reform. However, with the election of Ebrahim Raisi, and then you would see sort of ebbs and flows of that, right? Sort of when a more conservative president like Ahmadinejad would take office, he would, promise that women would be apprehended and greater morality would be brought to the streets. And especially over the course of the sort of summer, women would be arrested and harassed more. With Ebrahim Raisi, who's the most conservative president that Iran has had in post-revolutionary Iran. He was a protector of the shrine, of the holiest shrine in the country, the head of the judiciary, so very sort of conservative pedigree. As soon as he took office, he said, I am going to bring morality back to the streets, not least because, and Sam, over the last 3-4 years, Iranian women have actually pushed back against the hijab. So we've seen this, what a sociologist called Asif Fayyad calls non-movement. So through not really political organizing, but everyday practices, they had already loosened the hijab laws in the public spaces. So they'd already sort of, let the headscarf roll to their shoulders, not bothering to put it back right away. So across the city, Iranians had seen a pushback against the hijab that was, unprecedented, even though they'd done it over the last 2-3 decades. But the visuals of this was really unprecedented to the extent that one would see many women without headscarves. And so he said, I'm going to bring the morality back to the streets. And so the morality police became much harsher against women. And so we reached the point where Mahsa Amini, somebody who was comparatively actually well-dressed, and this was part of the discourse, right? When you see the CCTV footage of her from within the holding ground where she was held by the morality police, she's wearing a long black robe, she's wearing a headscarf, her hair is pretty well covered. That is pretty impeccable hijab compared to some of the women you will see in Tehran streets who are not even wearing actually a coat and whose headscarf is more like a bandana. And so that, I think, really enraged people because they could identify with Mahsa Amini as somebody who could be anyone's wife, sister, mother. She was very, very sort of, an everyday kind of woman that everybody could identify with, and hence the protests.
And how did that, and you talked about, this is a movement for broader political change. And there's been some discussion as to whether, is this an uprising, a response, that is sort of like limited to that cultural norm or I guess police brutality, or is this a revolution that is looking to wholesale sort of change the structure of society? Give us your sense of what's going on there, and what the political agenda is.
So I think the best way to call this is a revolutionary uprising. And I think the aim of it, not because of what I think, but because of the slogans that we see on the streets and the chants and the demands of the demonstrators and protests that we see on the street, is it's not just about the hijab. They are calling for the downfall of the regime. They're not asking for concessions. They're not asking for reforms. They are simply saying enough with this. And, when we see the art and the cultural production that's part of it, we see how textured and nuanced this movement is and how it's ultimately a movement and a revolution for life, right? For a better future, going against the kinds of repression that has been imposed on women's and everybody's bodies, the kinds of regulatory biopolitics of the Islamic Republic that have meant that people cannot aspire to live the kinds of lives that they imagine. And so it's a very imaginative and creative movement as well. But for sure, it's, this is not a movement just to bring down the morality police or to change the laws over hijab. This is a movement for wholesale change. And if you look at the photos and videos coming out of Iran over the last 3 days, although we have to stress that internet is so severely restricted by the government that what we see is a very small percentage of what people are able to send out, you see masses of people all across Iran chanting those very slogans for the downfall of the regime.
So are they looking for a more secular regime? Are they looking for any type of economic structural changes, or is it more they're looking for something that's more democratic? Where does it fall on, or is it across all three of those silos?
I think it's across all those three. Iranians have now lived through decades where religion, Islam, has been imposed by the running government officially. And, there have been many conversations, and especially on social media, this discourse is rampant among social media users, where they just believe that the Islamic Republic has corrupted Islam by imposing it in a public way and by relying on it for its political capital. And that has both corrupted Islam and it has corrupted the politics. So they're looking for sure, if if we live to see another sort of day for Iran beyond the Islamic Republic, that government for sure will be a secular and democratic one, if things go well.